In 2014, the Islamic State was tearing through Syria as the country collapsed into civil war. In January 2025, I travelled to Rojava, a Kurdish-led autonomous region in Syria, to see what life is like now for the people who triumphed over the jihadists.
أنا 11 تنا نبون شبرقو هناك أسباب دهيرن و11 زنديها
از همه از یپجمه از جنکم و از دکارم پاراستنا آخا خاجی بکن پاراستنا گلی خاجی بکن پاراستنا نرخن مروباهی جی بکن
معاناة كبيرة يعني الكلاب عم تفوت علينا على الخيام والله الكلاب عم تفوت علينا على الخيام.
I wanted to find out how this fledgling democracy in the Middle East is coping with the fall of Syria's former president, Bashar al-Assad, and the rise of new Islamist rulers, HTS.
Told that if we start to walk down this road, there's a high chance that we will be shot by snipers.
And I also discovered firsthand the threats its people face from Turkey and Turkish-backed militias as they try to rebuild their shattered nation.
The authorities here and the administrators here have been forced to level some new land to build yet more graves and more plots.
ولد حيوتي ما دو بريكي ام بخوزن عفريني ما بقري امار انسان اوفو خوزر مكيفو.
This is Between Democracy and War, my journey through Rojava. When Syria's civil war erupted in 2011, the Kurds formed a mixed-gender militia, the YXG, to protect their territories in the north. 2 years later, the all-female YPJ was created as women seized the opportunity to solidify their military and social autonomy.
Behind me is the command center for the YPJ. This is where all of the major military decisions are made and disseminated to the different units.
Inside this compound, new recruits are trained, their fallen sisters are remembered, and war plans are drawn. At the control center, I met Roxanne, a YPJ commander and spokeswoman who told me more about the group's origins and why its existence is such a radical idea.
آبابونا یپجی ام بیشن پیوستیک براستیجی گاوه کی گله کی دیروکی و گرینگ بوکو یپجی نتنه هزکی لشکریه یعنی دسپیک دا گوهرتنا مل فکر دا جن چوا دکاره سلاح را بکه یا دا جن چوا دکاره دجیهن سیاسی دا بیشن لشکری دا آبوری دا جی خواب بگیره.
A lot of people will say, you know, men are stronger, faster, they're more equipped for war. What are the advantages women bring that a fighting force without women simply doesn't have?
جی کو جن نه به جیان لنینه یکو دواره جیان دا بیشن دوسن و دیسپلین پیشنگتی وان پیشنگتی جن پیشنگتی یپجی هم دجیان دا هم دوره خستنبونی دا هم دواره فکر دا هم دواره لشکرتی دا هم دواره رخستنبونی دا همو وران دا یپجی پیشنگتی جراده که البته ایریشی کو داعش جیکیه ایریشی که نه چکداریه کو تنه کشتنه تنه کوکوشیه قرکرنه کلکه ایریش سر دیروکه سر چاندا گلانه ایریش سر هبونا جنه ایریشی که ایدئولوژیکه.
The creation of the YPJ was a landmark moment for Rojava's women and the population as a whole, but within a matter of months, its members found themselves facing off against arguably their ultimate foe, ISIS. Their ruthless, absolutist brand of Islam represents the antithesis of the values and ideals held by the YPJ.
In the military operation in combat, you were able to defeat ISIS, and what is their reaction when they're fighting you on the battlefield?
جبو خواکی اوی دیدن سر دست جن گرک نین کشتن جبر جنه بچوک دبینن جنه وک هبون نابینن جنه وک ام بیشن دیروک نابینن ناسنامه جنه اعتراف نکن اوسا هر بچوک و میذاکرنه دا دم یان سر دست مثلا یپجی واره کشتن بگوتن بلا دست سر دست یپجی نین کشتن اما بچن جهنمه جبر جنه بچوک دبینن یان جی مثلا گرتنه وانا بلا جن نزی منابن چاو از سر دست جن یپجی وارم کشتن تشتكي عيبه يعني جبونا حرامه يعني ورا كشتن يعني ورا قرتن چاو ام ناكهبن جنتي ويدمن دفيكو ام بري ورن ام خابكو جن كليتي جنتي تنبوانا رو.
Following the defeat of ISIS in Syria, tens of thousands of jihadist fighters sit in makeshift prisons, while their radicalized families are held in refugee camps, waiting for an opportunity to break out. I went to explore the largest of them all, Camp Al-Hol.
This is the perimeter road heading around Al-Hol refugee and ISIS camp. Behind these gates are around 35 to 40,000 people living in pretty tough conditions. We're about to enter the camp and see what life is like in what is essentially a fully functioning city.
Al-Hol was first created in the early 1990s for Gulf War refugees and continued to expand amid the US-led invasion of Iraq and the Syrian civil war. But when the ISIS army was defeated in 2019, after years of bitter conflict, Rojava suddenly had to contend with a tidal wave of jihadist prisoners and their extremist families. The adult male fighters are held in dedicated facilities, often old schools or hospitals that have been transformed into penitentiaries. But with limited resources, authorities had no choice but to house the families in Al-Hol, alongside other refugees from Iraq and Syria. Amid the instability in Syria following the overthrow of former President Bashar al-Assad, the camp administrators are worried about the prospect of a full-scale uprising. I met Jihan Hanan, one of two chief administrators with the unenviable task of keeping this makeshift city functioning, even as ISIS cells try to sabotage her efforts.
فرجاراج مرة مثلا وك آگاهیتین وك أخبارتين إنه إمكانية رشكل سرقان بي هاي ويادن تشتي از دخازم واجبهم إنه يعني تهديدك راس سرهبونا ما هي وك كرد يعني مثلا هذا بيم درد كافن مثلا جمرو دبين يا خنازير تنش كردار دبين يعني ديما كي أمبونا جمانتيا ما حفظ كرني يعني جوهر إيه من لبرجافي من أجر تشتك شيء ببي يان قداعش جندا زندي ببي ومصيري ما إيه شنغالي وإزيدي وخراب تربي يعني.
More than 150 murders have been recorded in the camp since 2019, an average of more than 2 per month. Jihan showed us the remains of a woman who was discovered just weeks ago in the notorious Camp 6, which is the camp in Al-Hol reserved for the families of foreign fighters who came from around the world to join ISIS. Her rotting remains had been lying partially mummified in a shallow grave between 2 tents housing extremist families. With that unsettling thought in mind, it was time to explore the heart of Al-Hol for myself. I was struck by how advanced the camp's services had become. We knew many residents had phones, but discovering fully fledged tech shops along the main road was astonishing.
So this is one of the most popular phones that is sold in this camp. Thousands of people in this camp have a mobile phone, and there are mobile networks and internet connections here. So not only can people communicate with other members of the camp, they can also communicate outside.
This is just one of many security dilemmas facing Jihan and other administrators. Technology and internet access improve the lives of the camp's refugees, but it also means that ISIS gangs can freely communicate with fellow extremists on the outside. Despite the perpetual danger, many refugees here remain defiant and hopeful of a peaceful future.
واحنا نتأمل إن شاء الله إنه سوريا يعم الأمن والأمان بها والاستقرار ويكون بلد مسالم لأنه بصراحة الشعوب يعني الشعب العراقي على الشعب السوري تعبوا بصراحة من المشاكل اللي جاية تصير واللي يقع الضحية هو بيقع الناس الفقراء بصراحة الناس هم الفقراء اللي جاي يقعون ضحايا يعني احنا بدنا شنو الشعب بده شوي رفاهية بده استقرار بده أمن بده أمان تمام.
Word of our presence in the camp spread quickly, and soon we were surrounded by dozens of people. I was stopped by a woman in a niqab. She refused to give me her name or say where she was from, but she confirmed she had been brought to the camp in 2019, the year ISIS fell. I asked her what life was like behind the fences.
الظروف يعني الأولاد ما عم يتعلموا برد أولادنا يعني برد يعني وشوف هالأحوال عم تنزل علينا المطر مع الخيام معاناة كبيرة يعني الكلاب عم تفوت علينا على الخيام والله الكلاب عم تفوت علينا على الخيام يعني لا في شو بدنا نحكي حالة مأساوية والله العظيم حالتنا وسائلها فلاقونا حل وطالعونا لنا 6 سنين هون على شو يعني أطفال صغار يعني شو ذنب الأطفال الصغار يعني عم يربوا عم يجي جيل ورا جيل نحن قاعدين نستنى بالمخيم يعني وهي قعدتنا يعني 6 سنين، لا في زياره، لا بيجوا اهالينا بيزورونا، لا بيجي حدا، نحن اولادنا برا بدهم يجوا يزورونا، بدهم يشوفونا، بدنا نحن نشوفهم يا اخي. ما في ليش يعني، شو السبب يعني انتم حاصلنا هالحسره هون؟ والله ما عملنا شيء يعني، هالاولاد ما عملوا شيء، هالامهات هالكبار عم بتموت هون، النساء الكبار.
So we're just leaving Al-Hol camp. We spent maybe an hour walking around, talking to people, getting a feel of what life is like here. Began very tense, I must admit. We attracted a lot of attention and some people didn't seem particularly happy to have us here. But after maybe 10-15 minutes, they got used to our presence. People were quite curious. They wanted to ask us who we were, where we were from. And they were actually very open. They wanted to tell their story. And for all intents and purposes, this is a functioning city. But of course, with the amount of resources they have and the difficulties they face, it is extremely chaotic. We're now heading to camp number 6, which is where foreign citizens who came here to join ISIS are stationed. Because of security reasons and because it's impossible to police the camp, because there are simply so many of them, we're talking nearly 7,000 people, we are not able to enter the camp. We're told that we will effectively be attacked, assaulted, and they'll try to kill us if we get out and walk around and film. But we're going to drive through the camp, and you will hopefully be able to see a snapshot of what life is like there.
Even the Asaish, Rojava's internal security forces, only patrol it in heavily armed pickup trucks.
Behind me you can see quite a lot of camp number 6. There is food and water provided. You can see the water tubs on top of the houses and the tents. There are solar panels providing electricity and power, but these are often attacked by the people in the camp, I'm told. The atmosphere here is certainly tense and a lot more quiet. It's somewhat of an uneasy feeling.
The Syrian Democratic Forces, a group of allied militias that constitute Rojava's military, have a few hundred fighters stationed around the perimeter, but they simply do not have the resources to properly police the camp. The scale of Al-Hol is scarcely believable, but it is just one of many facilities holding ISIS members that the democratic governing body in Rojava must maintain. Now the SDF are stretched thin. They're fighting on multiple fronts against Turkish-backed militias and ISIS sleeper cells, all while being targeted by Turkish airstrikes. There is also no telling whether Syria's new rulers, the Islamist group Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, will allow Rojava to retain its autonomy. If Western nations refuse to repatriate their citizens from ISIS camps, or at least provide the resources to help maintain them, the SDF warn they may have to abandon them. To learn more, I spoke with Siamend Ali, a representative of Rojava's People's Protection Units, which form the backbone of the SDF.
وكواني صار زمان هيئة تحرير الشام دبيجي جرك قصد سلاح ديني جرك أنجي حمو فصيلين لسوريا جرك سلاح ديني خستيك كي أرينية بلاد نارن تملا كده أوي الشر بدي أسكناندن اللي قالوا إنها الشر هدي أسكناندن أنا الشر السرمتي ليه في حالي حاضر ده قال ما راستي إيريشاتي راستيكم كوجياتي بيجومان تشك داين انتحاره شما حطان هذا داعش تنا نبوه شبرقو هناك أسباب دهلن قو داعشين زنديها نايلي قو داعش بكبي يك وكو آني سر زمان حرمن قونها ندبن سروريا مرنا أو در حمود بن هيلين داعشي داعش تقاري الور خط هفقار بكي خط النشط بكي تجنيد بكي أكاديمياتي خوفا بكي والسرمة إيريشا بكي أب حطاقو هنا زمين وخون أحلام ضدنا شانين ضاشين بشارتي وتفقر أخو خرطر بك أمنها لسر قلق جبهة شرتك يعني جبهة تركيا وهوا البندن وينا جبهة جي هندري داعشو إرهابا ويا أم توازنك هول ضدن قو أم بإصرار هردو قادة سر بكهفن أب مسؤوليتك كمان.
Clearly, Rojava's ISIS-riddled camps present a monumental challenge. But the echoes of jihadist rule are visible everywhere across this beautiful yet broken landscape. Of all the cities in Syria conquered by the Islamic State, few experienced more death and destruction than Kobani and Raqqa.
I'm standing in the square of Arin Merkan in the city of Kobani. Kobani is one of the largest cities in northeast Syria, just a few hundred meters away from Turkey. And in 2014, it was the site of one of the worst battles against ISIS. The extremists, having spread their caliphate rapidly across northeast Syria, launched an all-out assault on the city in September of 2014. In the first couple of weeks of conflict, around 150,000 people fled, but not before ISIS managed to execute a few hundred of them. In the past 10 years, the residents of Kobani have returned and they've tried to rebuild their city, but now they face a new threat: Turkey and Turkish-backed militias. The demolished buildings, remnants of tanks and mortars you see around me, constitutes Kobani's war museum. This part of the town has been left untouched as a reminder of the sacrifices that were made to liberate the city from ISIS, and also of the threat and the destruction caused by Turkey. Behind me you can see the Turkish flag maybe 300, 400 meters away. The Turkish border is stationed right behind the war museum, and we're told that if we start to walk down this road, there's a high chance that we will be shot by snipers.
This so-called museum still occupies a huge part of the city. The few buildings left standing are pockmarked with bullet holes. Rusted shells of vehicles and heavy weapons litter the streets. Now, with the sector largely abandoned, nature is steadily reclaiming the land. Dogs, cats, sheep and chickens have all made their homes in what remains of these obliterated structures. But beyond the occasional bleat and bark, and the crunch of rubble underfoot, it is eerily silent here.
A couple of residents of Kobani are taking us through the outer edges of the war museum to show us around, show us where some of the worst battles took place, and show us where the commander of the SDF was killed fighting ISIS.
Facing annihilation, Rojava's Kurdish People's Protection Units, the YPG and all-female YPJ, fought tooth and nail to prevent ISIS from conquering the whole city. With their backs against the Turkish border, the fighting devolved into horrific close-quarter combat. Every building became an ambush site, every alleyway a potential killing field. I was grateful to have a local to help me negotiate this apocalyptic landscape, because unexploded ordnance still remains under the debris. My guide explained how Kobani's defenders were forced to go house to house, confronting the jihadists as the US began pounding ISIS command centers with airstrikes.
یعنی حتی حوال گوبا کشار دکر مابینی حوال دیوار بو یوانو چتا و دیوار و پنجره و جور بمب دستا دوید نهفته می هرتش دیم نوب دو سرکفته.
As if to prove his point about the brutality of the combat, moments later my guide ushered me into a rubble-filled crater. This, he said, was once a building used by ISIS as a field hospital, until it was targeted in an American strike. Within a few seconds of pulling away rocks and broken bits of building, he was holding up chunks of what was unmistakably human bone. Moments later, he produced 3 vertebrae of a jihadist's spinal column, along with parts of skull and what looked like a jawbone. After I inspected the chunks of skeleton, my new friend let them tumble to the ground. Then, my interpreters, who grew up with the horrors of ISIS on their doorstep, stood on the bones and ground them into the dirt as we left. Clearly, the people of Rojava are still plagued by the memory of life under ISIS rule, but they are also dedicated to honouring those who sacrificed everything for their freedom. After leaving the War Museum, I headed for the Martyred Families Centre, a facility that provides support to the loved ones of people killed fighting ISIS and in other conflicts, including Turkey's ruthless military operations. Here, there is a memorial hall where a headshot of every fighter who has perished on the front lines is framed and displayed. It was in this immensely sobering location, wallpapered by the faces of the dead, that I met a woman named Kalima. She had the excruciating job of cleaning the corpses and helping their families prepare them for burial.
أو شهيدات يعني شهيد كات أود درو كفن ذكر فوق وتفات شون يعني كاري هاري زحمة سرملي أندامي سازي مال بطي شهيدة من جبركو تدمي إنسان هكي ربدي بسني تدمي ناسنا مي شهيدة كدين تجي برس بكي وتبشرة توي بخوا كفن بكي وباشيري يعني وانا جي ما ورقات كرر ما جيد دين وما جيب كفن ذكر وما جيب شورتن وما جيب كرنا عردي ايه توري زحمت يعني ام سازي ام هم ايشجي مالباتا دكشينن ام هم ايشجي وانا كوقتي كي دكرو ددرو كفن ذكر.
It came at a huge cost, but on January the 26th, 2015, the ISIS scourge was finally expelled from Kobani and the city was officially declared liberated. Within weeks, tens of thousands of residents had returned, and the war-torn community set about rebuilding. Now, although the battle scars are still clearly visible, Kobani's centre is vibrant and bustling once again. Children play in parks and sports fields, and shops once stocking the niqab can sell resplendent, colourful dresses. Although roughly 70% of the infrastructure was damaged in the battle to liberate Kobani, ISIS never managed to conquer the entire city. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said for Raqqa. This city, located further south in Rojava on the banks of the Euphrates River, was completely overrun by ISIS and served as its stronghold in Syria from 2014 until the group was eventually forced out in 2017.
This busy intersection is called Naim Square in Raqqa. This is the scene that ISIS used to broadcast its brutality to the world and to show the other civilians here what would happen to them if they did not fall in line. Many people were executed, beheaded, and their heads placed on pikes and steel rebar surrounding the square.
Much like in Kobani, Kurdish troops were forced to go house to house under fire from heavy weapons, IEDs, and suicide bombers to eliminate the jihadists, while US drones and warplanes struck from above. Now, where the extremists once tortured and executed their captives for the world to see, families and friends are free to relax and meet to simply watch the world pass by, just like they did before ISIS arrived. But because Raqqa was under total ISIS control, and the efforts to oust them covered the whole city, the destruction here was absolute. Not only do you see the fallout of war everywhere, you experience it with your other senses. Much of the city remains without power and hot water, and desperate refugees have no choice but to burn plastic and rubbish to keep warm. Before long, my nose became stuffy and my throat itchy, thanks in part to the toxic smoke, but also the thick dust that coats every surface. This is the pulverized remnants of destroyed buildings, which are whipped up by the slightest breeze and blown into your stinging, irritated eyes. Of all the places I visited during my time in Rojava, Raqqa was where I felt the most uneasy. Perhaps I was simply not used to witnessing such devastation, but the atmosphere felt tense, as though chaos could break out again at a moment's notice. For the people of Rojava, though, this feeling is nothing new. Since former Syrian President Bashar al-Assad was overthrown in December 2024 by the Islamist rebel group HTS, Rojava's democratic administration has had to consider the very real possibility of another civil war. In the meantime, parts of the region are still under attack from Turkish-backed militias and Turkish airstrikes. This is because Turkey is desperate to undermine Kurdish autonomy and sees the Kurdish militia defending Rojava as terrorists. Ironically, Turkey and its proxy forces have conducted several attacks on Rojava's civilian populations in recent years. Now they're fighting to take control of the Tishrin Dam, a vital piece of infrastructure that provides electricity to a huge part of the region.
We were at this very square in Kobani just hours ago and it was almost silent. Now the square is heaving with thousands of people protesting ongoing hostilities at the Tishrin Dam. We were invited to join a civilian convoy that was headed to the dam just yesterday, and we declined because we didn't have any personal protection equipment with us. It turns out that our choice was vindicated because several people were killed in drone strikes perpetrated by Turkish-backed militias and the Turkish Air Force. Now, thousands of people are here to commemorate the memory of the people killed and to protest the ongoing war.
People of all ages, genders and ethnicities had taken to the streets, and as I navigated my way through the sea of protesters, it quickly became clear this was not simply an anti-war demonstration. It was an outpouring of rage and grief from a population beleaguered by years of conflict.
And tell us why you're here today.
ام في درج بو إيريشي هاني سر حوالي ماي درباسي بندابة تشرين بوي ام رابونه چقاس بالا فری داگر کریا ترک سر مهبه چقاس مخینن لبرخدان جیان تجاری ام پاشتا ناکشن.
Everyone we've spoken to so far seems to describe the situation as everybody being involved in the resistance, because everybody knows a brother, a daughter, a son, a sister who has been injured or killed. Can you tell me about the feeling here today? What do you feel when you march, and what do the people around you feel?
دمي ام درد كافن ماشي ما وفاتشتي ما جبو قال ما ام درد كافن او شهيد بكافن ام شهيد بكافن وكافه شهيد جي روماتن شهيد جي هاني ام هيزا خجوانا دقرن شهيد مانا ام تجاري باشتا ناكشن او نام شهيد ما دخن وداره هاني سيفيل لفه داره اما خونه وانا راكنه وتجاري جي باشتا كشاندن تنبامه.
And do you have a final message that you want to tell people?
مسج ما جبو عالم جشكي جبو حمو دولت هاني خا انسانيت دا دبينه ودبيجه ام پشت انسانيت دانه ام دبيجن ون كدرنه ون كورن كافا ورقص انسان شهيد دكافه انسان هاني سيفيل دكافن.
As the protesters began their march, I couldn't help but think what my fate might have been had I travelled to the dam with their countrymen and women. I decided to visit Kobani's sprawling cemetery, where the people killed the day before were being laid to rest.
We are walking through the cemetery of Kobani, where thousands upon thousands of white tombs hold the corpses of people who were killed in the battle for Kobani against ISIS, but also in fighting across the region. The cemetery is striking for a couple of reasons. One is because, as you can see behind me, you're confronted with thousands and thousands of faces of people who've been killed here in the past few years, but also because it is the only place that we've seen since our time began here in Rojava that hasn't been demolished by some kind of fighting or some kind of bomb. Behind me, you should be able to see the scale of the cemetery and just how large it is. But if you look on this side, you can see that the authorities here and the administrators here have been forced to level some new land to build yet more graves and more plots.
We're driving on the road out of Kobani through the town of Sidin. We heard a pretty significant explosion. We looked out the window, and a few kilometers away, a huge dust cloud coming up through the hills, not far away from our position, and then moments later, there was a second blast. The explosions were a few kilometers away from our car, so we're not too worried, but it is a pretty good reminder of the daily threats that the people living here face.
Fortunately, I avoided any more airstrikes and made it safely to meet the leaders of Rojava's governing body.
We're here today because we've managed to secure an interview with the two co-chairs who lead the region. We're going to talk to them about the system of governance they've created here, how they managed to administer a region in the midst of such chaos from ISIS and various other threats they face, and we're going to talk to them about what they think the future holds for Syria and the region.
Rojava is often referred to as the Middle East's democratic experiment because of the unique nature of its governance system. Rather than power being centralised with a single entrenched president or a handful of politicians and clerics, the region is divided into several cantons, whose councils have near complete independence to manage their own affairs. This ensures all ethnic and religious components of Rojava's diverse population have a say in the decision-making process. My interviewees, the administration's co-chairs, are responsible for coordinating across the cantons and implementing feedback from the councils below them.
هذه التجربة هي فريدة وتجربة جديدة، ولكن استطعنا من خلال هذه التجربة أن نحافظ على التماسك المجتمعي، وخاصة بعد دحر تنظيم داعش، وحافظنا على وحدة الشعوب الموجودة في هذه المنطقة وتماسكها.
Your values are very much the antithesis, like the complete opposite to the values that ISIS have. And obviously your region was forced to make a huge sacrifice in order to defeat them geographically, but you are continuing to fight them ideologically. How do you build a strong society, build economic success while fighting such a difficult war?
يعني استطعنا بالإدارة الذاتية بفضل طبعا قوات سوريا الديمقراطية اندحر هذا التنظيم عسكريا، لكن مثل ما تفضلت ايديولوجيا ما زال في هناك بقايا أفكار داعش. نتحدث بكل صراحة، هذه الإدارة هناك دائما محاربة لها من قبل الدولة التركية، فالدولة التركية دائما تحاول ضرب الاستقرار في مناطق الإدارة الذاتية، وهذا ما شاهدناه طوال الفترات السابقة.
Having discussed the difficulties of facing ISIS and the threat of Turkey and Turkish-backed militias, I wanted to know the co-chair's position on Syria's new rulers, HTS, an Islamist group that developed from Al-Qaeda.
نها دهندور سوری دا گوهرتنا کجنک مازن چبو Averre ve beriyedem ki eğer bikar rastî jî her yekê ji me bide hîskirin ku ew muwatinekî Sûriye mafê wî tacîdarin yan jî parastîne هل بدو هركس خوديته ببيني وببي بشر بجوا سوريا.
HTS have said recently that they are aiming to guarantee the safety and security of all these different groups. They've tried to rehabilitate themselves on the world stage and present a new face. Are you hopeful that they will be able to follow through on those promises? Or are you still, are there big concerns over whether that will actually come true?
المرحلة المقبلة تنتظر بصراحة ليست الأقوال، إنما الأفعال هي التي تترجم هذه الأقوال. يعني نحن ننتظر أن يكون هناك أولا تمثيل لكل المكونات في الحكومة الانتقالية أو هيئة الانتقالية، وأيضا ننتظر أن يكون هناك مشاركة للجميع، ونتمنى أن تكون حقيقة الإدارة الجديدة بقيادة أحمد الشرع صادقة في نواياها أيضا بالعمل من أجل بناء سوريا جديدة تكون تمثل كل السوريين.
It wasn't long after we filmed this interview that HTS began tarnishing hopes of a multi-ethnic, multi-faith Syrian government anytime soon. In March, interim President Bashar signed into effect a temporary constitution cementing HTS rule for at least 5 years. His office later said that Rojava's call to adopt a decentralized system of government in Syria posed a threat to national unity. Meanwhile, HTS militants filmed themselves slaughtering civilians in Alawite communities in retaliation for attacks by pro-Assad loyalists on checkpoints.
أول شيء نحن نوجه رسالة لكل العالم بأن أولا رفع العقوبات عن سوريا والمساهمة في إعادة الإعمار وتحقيق الاستقرار هو شرط ضروري لتحقيق سوريا ديمقراطية في النهاية. نحن تخلصنا من الهيمنة الإيرانية في سوريا، لا نريد أن يكون هناك هيمنة لدول إقليمية أخرى، وأحسب الذكر هنا تركيا، أيضا على الدول الأوروبية أن تقوم بهذا الدور وتوقف الأطماع التركية في سوريا وأن تتركنا نعيش في سلام.
The governance model of the autonomous administration and the wider foundation of Rojava's egalitarian political and civil society was born from the philosophies of Turkish Kurd Abdullah Öcalan. The reverence the people have here for the man they call Apo, or uncle, is impossible to overstate. His face adorns almost every office, billboard, and public place in Rojava. But the association with Öcalan continues to bring war to their doorstep. Öcalan was a founding member of the PKK, a movement that has fought a decades-long insurgency against the Turkish government for Kurdish autonomy. He was arrested in 1999 and has been imprisoned by Turkey ever since. Turkey treats all political and military groups associated with him, including the YPJ in Syria, as terrorists. Turkey's President Erdogan has used this reasoning to justify repeated invasions of northern Syria against the Kurds. These operations have killed thousands of people and driven hundreds of thousands from their homes. Residents in Kobani, just a few hundred meters from the Turkish border, are all too aware of the Turkish threat.
اردوغان دبي چه دبي حاجات انه حاجاتك يرشي روجافا ويرشي كوبانيتك اول سر ما قدك ساده قدك كيربي قدك نين قدك البنيه التحتيه دخينه مثلا داري ما دخينه الزيتوني ما دخينه الاوفي ما دخينه البوكو زافي ما دخينه لزاري تشيك دخينه وانا جيب هكاكنا حرتشي سر ما قدك جيب حاجاتي انه باكاكا الفرشت غاري باكاكا غانما باكاكا اوفا باكاكا نونا باكاكا مثلا ساده جد بحاجاتي انه بهكاكي اردوغان تشتي توري هونيكو دكي نق حاجات بهكاكيه حاجات كرده خوازي كرد جعر دنيروكي اما امن رانوبن ام خلص نوبن ام يك بميننجي اما ديسا جيان بكن زاروكا ونن وبازاروكا بمينا كرد بمينا.
The Syrian civil war, the fight against ISIS, and Turkey's military operations have collectively displaced about 14 million people, half of whom remain refugees within Syria itself. Now, almost every town and city in Rojava is filled with internally displaced people just trying to survive. Amid the demolished buildings of Raqqa, I found a camp hosting hundreds of refugees from 30 different families. Elif and Bakir are among the oldest residents living here. They told me how their life in the city of Afrin was uprooted by Turkey's invasion in 2018 and the devastating impact it had on their family.
وكده خازن يعني ليش كاتن شيء به ما زحمة دي وقت بقي شهيد عندك بروح خد الجداية وليت ما هابين كنا ولا ما هابين عم بدار خسته بتوق الطوفان بالطيارة لما خسته
ولد حياتي ما دوباريكي عم خازن عبريني ما بقره أمر سر أخو خسر متيخو وام حياتك خو حجر أجن لو حياتي ما رضوت نعمو معني بيكش كت خو إيش كي أب تعمش خو ببينن اللي بداري تعم تناي أم دخوزن عبريني ما بقره شابو بدم بيشي ما دارن أم خدوية شهيدونه وام كيف ولو تيجي بقرين غصب عنيكي عند اللانية توري ساوي شتاوا أمي خوب خوام نكنو بوندكن بالوبي ملاتكي عرب كرموج إرمانة وشوري مسيحي إزيدي أم دبن أم ملاتن أم جياكن أم بياكبيني ملاتكي بوندكن تخيرش مانو غارقام بهابدقينن أم ياكبيني تشيكن هاو ما خرادكي.
We're standing outside what used to be a school in Raqqa, but amid the war with ISIS and all the instability that followed, this has now been turned into effectively a refugee camp for young kids who are displaced. There's no power in the building, and you can see that the remnants of old desks and school chairs are kind of littered around the place. The kids are now going to give us a tour of the school and show us the conditions that they've been living in. You can see that there is no real system to dispose of waste. They're forced to just clean the floor with whatever dirty water they can find nearby. As you walk around, you can smell fuel from the generators that are giving this place what little power that it has. And now we are about to get onto the roof, and hopefully we'll be able to get a slightly clearer picture of the conditions around this building. 360 degrees around the school, you can see the whole city, and the battle scars of the time that Raqqa was under ISIS rule are still very evident. But that being said, despite the limited resources here, there are signs of some kind of rebirth. You can see on the other side of the school, there is a building in the midst of being built, and as we were driving into the city, we were seeing a lot of small-scale construction projects, so it's clear that the people here are in the process of rebuilding.
دو جورنام بوچبر بیم نب طایفا که رونا بس مساجر مسلحین به نوع مکات ام به ملت رو در کاتن و فاصلان چهتنجی به نوع ماجی کاتن ام طریقا که راوین و زروک حجدار زروک معنا تشتكي نمنطقة إنه سلاح تواري نوفي زروك نروكي أمو بنقاشي بتفاوضاته بقى شورا سر بكن راوش كنا جدية هم سعيدة كن أما أهم شيء أمانة يعني إنه معيشات يعني كاس نظران أهم شيء أمانة أما أمان تناي نالفرجي سورة هواي تناي أمان.
Before leaving the camp, I wanted to spend a bit of time with the kids and hear what they had to say. What's your favourite subject? And what's the best thing about school? David? Charlie?
My name is Khadija.
Nice to meet you, Khadija.
تجي بخيرات. دام مكتبم درس دادن مامستا درس داده أبوال خاردلیزم.
What's your favourite class? What do you like to learn the most?
زانیاری.
Science? Okay, what kind of science?
أثر حیوانات دادن مثلا زندی و نه زندی سرشناسی هم دادن سر لاور أو لاورن كل زندي و زندي.
And what would you like to do when you're older, when you grow up?
دكتور.
Interesting. I guess the science thing helps with that, right? Yeah. Thank you very much for your help. Really nice to meet you.
Thank you.
Shall we go play? Yeah? Let's go.
All of the families living in this former school were forced out of their homes around Afrin, one of several targets in Turkey's cross-border military operations. Ankara has funded and supported Syrian militias to conduct ground attacks, while Turkish warplanes and drones strike from above. It was one of these Turkish airstrikes that killed a young British woman named Anna Campbell. Unlike the women of Rojava, Anna was not born into war, but she is one of many men and women who felt compelled to join the revolution in Rojava and fight in its defence.
My name is Helene Karachoch. My name from before was Anna Campbell. I joined the YPG in March of last year because I wanted to participate in the revolution of women that is being built up here and fight and join also the weaponized fight against the forces of fascism. And I know how hard it can be in many different ways, in a lot of ways that I was not expecting as well. But I'm really excited to go and join so many brave friends that are fighting there now.
Anna died in March 2018 during Turkey's attack on the canton of Afrin in northern Syria. Now, 7 years on from her death, Anna's father Dirk Campbell is still fighting a battle with Turkish courts over the repatriation of her remains. I sat down with Dirk for a conversation about his daughter, why she joined the YPJ, and how he reflects on her sacrifice and legacy.
I was always, how should we say, determined to protect, and she had this instinct for justice.
Yeah.
She was always driven to protect the vulnerable, the weak.
To what extent did you have conversations with her prior to her leaving?
And this, I suppose, patriarchal, unconscious, I don't know, tendency to sort of question her more radical assumptions and things she was coming out with. In fact, when she said to me, "Dad, I'm going to Rojava," I said, "Well, it's been nice knowing you." It's like a witty sort of one-liner. I wish I'd talked to her. I wish I'd said, "So tell me about it." Yeah. Yeah, I'm really sad about that.
At what point were you able to share any kind of discussion with her once you'd arrived in Rojava? And at what point do you start to feel as though her life was in danger or that there was a serious concern for her well-being?
I did manage to talk to her very soon after she got there, and it was the day when 12 YPJ fighters had been killed by a Turkish airstrike across the border. They'd been literally targeting YPJ positions. And I said to her, "Look, people are getting killed around you." And she said, "There's nothing I can say to reassure you, Dad."
And how did you find out about the news that she'd been killed?
Her death. There was a knock on the door, and it was a member of the Kurdish community in Brighton. And as they opened the door, I said, "I could hear the worst," and they nodded. And then I knew she'd been killed, and that was absolutely devastating.
Perhaps it was quite telling that you were informed about the death of your daughter from a member of the Kurdish community in Brighton rather than a government official or a member of the Foreign Office. I know that prior to Anna's death, you were lobbying the British government to push Turkey to enact a ceasefire, and subsequently you tried to work with them to begin the process of having your daughter's remains repatriated. Can you tell us a bit about your engagement with the British government, what that process was like, and to what extent, if at all, they were kind of helpful in those communications?
And I wrote to my MP, and that was Maria Caulfield at the time. She passed on my email to Ben Wallace, who was Secretary of State for Defence, I think. And I got an answer from him via Maria saying that the Turks have a perfect right to defend their interests, and we are not taking sides. I then went to the Foreign Office, where Alistair Burt was Minister for the Middle East. And I said, the Turks have invaded a sovereign country, and they killed and displaced thousands of their citizens. What are you going to do about it? And they killed my daughter, and they haven't done anything about their obligations under the Geneva Convention. Alistair Burt said that this was a top priority for the Foreign Office, and they were going to pursue it with all speed and energy at their disposal with their opposite numbers in Turkey. Nothing ever happened.
You mentioned at the start of this conversation that you were, whether it be from some kind of paternal instinct or because you didn't have the same ideals, you were somewhat dismissive of her, and you felt that you clashed a lot when you spoke about this kind of thing. Now, 7 years on from her death, and you've obviously had a lot of time to reflect and think about that. How do you view her determination and her sacrifice and her principles now, looking back?
Yeah, I grieve for her all the time, and I feel guilty all the time. I blame myself for not talking to her and trying to dissuade her, but then I'm not sure if that would ever work. I don't know, so I didn't try hard enough. So yeah, I do feel that grief and I feel that pride, because her bravery is something to be proud of, and the fact that she, albeit briefly, extended the reach of the Kurdish struggle, the Rojava struggle, right across the world. I met fighters, international fighters in Rojava who said that they had been inspired to join the YPG.
Anna and others like her who integrated into Rojava and gave their lives for the cause are revered as martyrs by the YPJ. Their likenesses are everywhere, depicted on posters, emblazoned in murals and immortalized as statues. It's clear they are a source of great strength for those still fighting. But it's only when you drive around Rojava and visit its towns and cities that you realize just how many people have been killed trying to defend its democracy. We have now spoken with and interviewed dozens of people during our time here in Rojava, and every single one of them personally knows somebody or has a family member or a friend who they've lost to the fighting. And it's when you come to a graveyard like this, where there are thousands of people behind me who have died in conflicts prior, but also brand new, fresh graves being dug on a daily basis, that you can't help but wonder how many more people, young and old, are going to fight and die for the right for this small democratic region to exist in peace. The prospect of a lasting and tolerable peace in Syria anytime soon remains bleak. The SDF are still fighting Turkish-backed militias, while HTS continues to consolidate its power over the rest of Syria as it seeks to usher in a new age of Islamic governance. Yet, almost everybody I met during my travels here expressed a defiant commitment to build a better future, in spite of the obstacles standing before them. Before I left Rojava, I asked Roxanne about her hopes for the future of the YPJ and Syria as a whole. Do you allow yourself to think or dream about a future where you don't have to fight? And do you think that that's a realistic possibility in your lifetime?
راسته دبیجه بناف به آخافتن حینا هاتی گوتن کو شته امن توان دور ناخینه و هر کس جوی جی خواب گیره و سوریا وی دموکراتیک بیبه لما حینا ها ما تشتک بچعب ندیکیه بهبینه کو واره گوهارتن يعني تشتک کو دبیجه سر عرده پیک واره اما دگوتن دا بمینه و پیشروج سوریا بر بکوفا بچه خویانا که يعني اگر بگوتن دا بمینه پیشروج سوریا و طاریبه ریش واره راوستاندن تجی دیس ام هیزه کی پاراستنه نه یعنی ام هر سر کار خوابن جبر کو ام نه هیزه کی تنه ام آوابونه کو جبو شر ام آوابونه ام جبو پاراستنه گله خوا آوابونه ام جبو